Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of George Mason University and Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, find other episodes, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. My guest today is Gene Epstein, economics editor at Barron's and the author of Econospinning, How to Read Between the Lines When the Media Manipulates the Numbers. Gene, welcome to EconTalk.
Well, I'm honored to be here as a regular listener of the show and a fan of the podcast.
Excellent.
I'm honored to be a guest.
Great. Our topic today is the gold standard, and you've been writing recently about the virtues of the gold standard, the underappreciated virtues, and the benefits that we would enjoy if we moved to a gold standard for our monetary policy. Mm-hmm. Tell us what's wrong with the Fed's handling of the money supply and how a gold standard would make it better.
Well, first let me say that I'm fully aware of the fact that even to talk about gold makes you sound like a heretic. John Maynard Keynes drove the gold advocates pretty much out of the temple of economics by condemning the gold standard as the barbarous relic. And so when I built my case for gold, I tried to find somebody of some note who'd ever said anything nice about gold. And as some people know, that was Alan Greenspan, the illustrious former Fed chairman, who at the age of 40, hardly a young, angry man, he was a mature economic consultant at the time, wrote an article called Gold and Economic Freedom, in which he made the major case for gold, that under a gold standard we would no longer have business cycles, that a gold standard, as he wrote, that under the gold standard, a free banking system stands as the protector of an economy's stability and balanced growth. He also pointed out, as though that advantage weren't enough, that the chronic deficit spending that government is addicted to through the unlimited expansion of credit would also come to an end. And that's important. Dick Cheney recently and famously told then Treasury Secretary Paul O'Neill that Reagan-proved deficits don't matter. And Dick Cheney then brought us the Iraqi War because deficits don't matter. After all, you can monetize the deficit if you're the federal government. So that's the second advantage of a gold standard, that it would make the government more accountable to the people. The third advantage is something that's been less important over the last 15 years or so, but Alan Greenspan in his recent memoir pointed out that it could be a problem later on, and that's galloping inflation of the sort that plagued us in the 1970s and 80s. I think we've been lucky over the last 15 to 20 years because there was the end of the Cold War, which brought about severe disinflation. I shouldn't say severe, happily. Blessedly, it brought about disinflation by opening up so much of the world to cheap labor. And we also had the benefits of accelerated productivity, which also brought disinflation. But Greenspan himself acknowledges that by 2030, some of those benefits could come to an end, that the incorporation of cheap labor from China and other parts of the world that were formerly communist could already be achieved, and so that benefit would be behind us. And at the same time, what he calls the tsunami of the unfunded liabilities of Medicare, especially Medicaid, and as well as Social Security, could also cause extreme inflationary pressures on the part of the federal government and pressure the Federal Reserve to print ever more money in order to finance that debt. So even that third advantage of inflation that we can deal with, and that even the idea that the Federal Reserve has effectively dealt with inflation over the last 15 to 20 years is not really the case. It's mainly the case that the Federal Reserve has been lucky.
Well, I just want to clarify one thing. When you say Greenspan acknowledges, there you meant the elder Greenspan, the more recent things he's written, not the piece from the 60s that he wrote about the gold standard. His concerns about galloping inflation and the unfunded liabilities as a modern. He wasn't that prescient, correct?
Oh, yes. No, he was. Thank you for the correction. No, he wasn't that prescient at the age of 40, but he is at least somewhat prescient about that at the age of 80 plus.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the some of these advantages or potential advantages. I'm with you on some of them, and I'm skeptical on some others. So I'd like to talk about them. Let's start with the deficits. I don't know what context Cheney was saying deficits don't matter.
Yeah.
I suspect that Reagan showed they don't matter. My suspicion is he was talking about them politically, but it is a problem potentially that government can spend more than it takes in. It's sometimes a good idea to spend more than you take in as an individual. Most people don't pay cash for their house. Most people don't pay cash for their car. They spread the payments for assets over a period of time. And some things the government does, not many, but some things that the government does do have benefits that are produced over time, and therefore it could be rational, reasonable, and a good idea to fund them over time via borrowing. I think the particular concern is that we fund things that are not very productive over time. And my general feeling on this, which I learned from Milton Friedman, is that it's not so much how we finance them, but what we spend the money on. So when I look at the deficit spending, I see more, it's not so much the deficit spending that's out of control, but government spending that's out of control. And whether if we had to fund it out of current spending, out of current revenue, I think the political pressure to reduce spending would be there. So I think that's a plus. But that's a budgeting problem, isn't it? Not so much a central bank problem. Or do you want to clarify that?
Yeah, sure. Well, the main way that the government is supposed to raise money is through taxing. And then to a limited extent, obviously, you can borrow against future taxes. Now, my point is that when Cheney made that remark, he probably didn't know quite what he meant either. He probably could not give you chapter and verse on how deficits get monetized. But to say that deficits don't matter when you're in charge of the federal government is to say something very significant. Because if Cheney had been in charge of a business, or if Cheney had been buying a house on his own, or if Cheney had even been in charge of a municipal or state government, he could hardly make the statement that deficits don't matter. Deficits, of course, do matter to those of us who cannot monetize our debt. And that was the significance, to my mind, of that remark, that he could only make it in the context of being a federal official, and that it isn't absolutely necessary for a federal official to completely understand the monetization process to be able to make that statement. Now, with respect to what you mentioned, Milton Friedman, I think that's very interesting, because Friedman constantly made the point that the political economy of government spending consists of sort of dealing with a teenager, namely that government essentially spends whatever it has and then some, whatever it has and then whatever it can borrow. It doesn't spend according to needs. It's got a hole. Its money burns a hole in its pocket. To whatever extent government can get money, it will spend money. And that's the fundamental problem, that when you have the potential for deficits not to matter, then government can fight wars, government can make promises that go to the moon with respect to, for example, our unfunded liabilities in Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. They now top $60 trillion. It's not their money, it's other people's money, but even beyond that, it's not just other people's money, it's money they can print. And,
well, let's come to that, but first I just want to say that that's a very important, the teenager model of government spending is a very important model. We're talking about it casually, but I think it's a very useful way to look at government spending in contrast with what I would call the textbook model. The textbook model is, well, there's certain things the private sector doesn't do well, public goods, things that have externalities, and therefore governments needed to step in to correct the market. And we've talked here on EconTalk about how sometimes that rationale is used to justify lots of things that the government doesn't do particularly well, although it can, in principle, certainly improve on the private decisions made by individual actors. It often, in practice, does not. But that sort of textbook idealized view of government certainly contrasts with the reality of the incentives faced by politicians. Politicians have no incentive to follow a textbook, what economists call often a social welfare function, some strategy for making, quote, society better off, which is, in my mind, a meaningless phrase. So I really like the idea of the teenager model, which is basically if they have it, they'll spend it. They're not too keen on giving it back unless we pressure them. And of course, we sometimes do. And you can view the Bush tax cuts as an attempt to get the government to get away from accumulating surpluses through large tax revenue. But let's hone in on this idea of monetizing the debt. We're recording this in the middle of May. In a week or so, there will be a podcast with Alan Meltzer that I have heard, Gene, you have not, where he talks about how LBJ, President Johnson, pressured Federal Reserve Chairman Martin to monetize the deficit spending to finance the Vietnam War. We didn't get into that very much other than to note it. So it would be great if you could talk about what you mean by the phrase monetizing the debt. What does the Fed do to monetize the debt and make deficit financing more convenient for the politicians?
Well, as a matter of fact, the Johnson case is interesting, especially because those were the days before the one major reform in hampering the ability of the government to monetize the debt, and that reform came in 1985, which was to index income tax brackets to inflation. In the Johnson days, it was fairly easy for the government, for the Federal Reserve, to expand the money supply, and by expanding the money supply, boosting incomes, and by boosting income, forcing us all into higher brackets.
Yeah.
That was also it was also especially easy in those days because we did have, this was before, of course, the Reagan tax cuts, which lowered the brackets. We did have brackets that were up to 70%. And so in those days it was possible not just to monetize the debt, but essentially to monetize government revenue by, again, expanding the money supply through the expansion of the money supply, pushing up incomes, and through the pushing up of incomes, people had higher brackets, and therefore a larger percentage of their income went to the government. We still have that mechanism to some extent, even with the indexing of brackets as of 1985. There is some potential for bracket creep. People can have higher incomes in their current brackets. In addition, the rest of the tax code on the federal and state level, as well as, of course, on the local level, is not indexed, so that capital gains and so on can rise if you raise if you boost the money supply.
I just want to clarify
Sure.
When you say it raises incomes, it raises nominal income. It raises the dollar-denominated income level of folks. As prices go up, markets force wages higher, supply and demand forces wages higher, and therefore measured income will be higher. You're not richer because unless something else has changed in the economy to make us more productive. But it's a nominal change that, as you say, pushes the proportion of income that people pay in taxes higher. But you're also referring to something more specific, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now that's actually monetizing government revenue on all levels through, as you correctly and very well explained, it's the rise of nominal income through the expansion of money supply. Now that's somewhat less available because of the indexing of brackets. Due to the sort of thing that everybody did notice, galloping inflation in the 1970s and early 80s, which forced that legislation through, and that was certainly a great achievement. Now, However, when Cheney said in 2002, and again I insist uniquely, he said this is a federal official, I don't think he would have the bad sense to say this as a city official or as a private individual or as a businessman, that deficits don't matter. Of course they do to the rest of us who cannot monetize the debt. But beyond that, the Federal Reserve can monetize the debt through its open market operations, and that what we have learned in the textbooks is open market operations essentially consists of the Federal Reserve buying debt, buying the government's debt, that's Treasury bills, bonds, and notes, and pumping money into the economy in that way. Now, the matter of fact, the monetization of the debt on the part of the Federal Reserve has become less important. The numbers I recently looked up show that really it's the monetization of the debt by central banks around the world that is even more important. About half of the increase of the debt from 2000 since 2000 through September of 2007. That is about 1.6 trillion out of an increase of 3.2 trillion. Has been taken up by foreign official holdings. Now, some of that is not the central bank, but much of it is.
Now,
and so, in effect, we've been selling some of our debt to the Bank of to the Bank of China, the central bank.
For sure. So some of it's going to foreign central banks. Some of it's going to
the Federal Reserve itself.
Right.
About $250 billion has been taken up. Again, the official numbers show. So these are not the sort of numbers the government advertises at parades, but that can be found if you look around. The General Accounting Office has available the numbers on foreign central banks, at least on foreign official holdings. It doesn't break it down to foreign central banks. And then the GAO and others do make available the debt, the increase in the debt held by the Federal Reserve. It's about $250 billion over the last, from 2000 through 2007.
But is it a bad thing that the Central Bank of China buys U.S. Treasury bonds?
Well, it is a bad thing. It is a bad thing.
Basically, you're saying they're financing the teenager, right?
Yes.
The federal government's spending more than it takes in. You can only do that if someone is willing to lend it to you. If the rates at which you lend get very high, then the teenager starts to think twice about it. Mm-hmm. And the rates haven't gone up very much. They've stayed very low. So basically, the willingness of China and others around the world, private and public actors, to buy U.S. Treasuries is why is that bad?
Well, it's bad. It's bad. First of all, if you and I disapprove of what the federal government is spending its money on, but
we do probably.
Yeah, many of us do. Some of us were not too happy about Cheney's Iraqi war. Of course, it wasn't just Cheney's, but when a federal official is able to say deficits don't matter, imagine you're saying that on the individual level, or if you're running a business. It doesn't matter how much money I borrow. I can spend whatever I want. If I go into debt, it doesn't matter. So I can wage war. I can have guns and butter. I can pass Medicare Part D, as the Bush administration did, and have endless giveaways and promise anything, because after all, deficits don't matter. Because I don't just raise money through taxes and borrowing against taxes. I have the power to print money. And again, I point out it's not that Cheney necessarily understood that the federal government has the power to print money. But what he was able to say was the sort of thing you cannot say if you're a state or local official, or if you're a businessman or an individual.
Well, this is a bit of a nitpick, and we should probably move on to the more substantive issues related to the gold standard. But as a citizen, I want government to wage war if it's a good idea.
Yes.
And if it's a bad idea, I don't want them to wage war whether they pay for it with taxes today or taxes tomorrow. What deficits do is allow federal governments to pay for current activity with taxes tomorrow. We call them bonds, but it's taxes tomorrow because the bonds have to be paid off unless we abrogate or break our promise, which would be a very costly procedure. So assuming that the U.S. government honors its promises to pay the bonds that it's issued, I would argue that the monetization part of it's been relatively unimportant, because that willingness of China and others to hold those bonds, and I think that's been a benefit in the sense that it means that borrowing is cheap. It's been a negative in the sense that it means it's financed. It's allowed the government to say things like deficits don't matter, politicians to say that, which is bad because it encourages bad spending. But again, I think the issue is bad spending. I think it's potentially the case that monetizing the debt is destructive if it leads to inflation. But I would argue that inflation in recent years has remained relatively low, and that is a statement about the role of those foreign governments to finance that debt. If they hadn't, then the government would have been in a different situation. If we couldn't count on foreign officials borrowing the money, lending us the money, then and others, then perhaps the cost of deficit spending and future taxes would have been sufficiently high that it would have constrained current levels of government spending. But in the absence of that, I would argue that the inflationary part of it's been relatively mild so far. I think what people worry about, somewhat correctly, but I'm not sure, is that if foreign governments decide they do not want to hold our debt, we may find ourselves in a situation where maintaining the current level of government spending would be very high, and we'd have to make some very unpleasant choices, politically and economically. Is that a fair summary?
Well, it's a fair summary from a certain point of view. Let me state a somewhat alternative view. Briefly read a sentence from a gold advocate named George Reisman, who wrote that when the government need not obtain its funds from the people, but instead can supply the people with funds, it can no longer easily be viewed as deriving its powers and rights from the people. Now, if you and I want the government to fund Medicare, if you and I want the government to wage war, then we'll vote for it with our taxes. It's very good for you and I to know that we have to make sacrifice, that resources are being taken from us when we vote for these things. And the only way for us to truly know is for us to pay more in taxes, or for us to at least understand that the government's power to borrow means that it's going to come out of future taxes. But when it comes out of printing money, either by our own domestic Federal Reserve or from central banks around the world, then we don't feel it, and they are not answerable to us, and they can run amok.
Guys, so here's where I disagree. Yeah. I think we do feel it. We feel it in a different way, and I think I don't want to minimize this distinction because I think there is an important how the body politic and how we as individuals respond to bad policies. Some policies make it easier for us to respond than others. Some the ways that they're structured. So, for example, future tax payments are less noticeable than current tax payments. Writing a check is more noticeable than having it withheld. These are psychological differences. And similarly, the Federal Reserve running amok and printing money to finance government spending via debt monetization by buying up government bonds also transmits to the body politic through inflation. Yeah. So, as inflation gets high, people yell. When taxes get high, people yell. When deficits get high, people yell in that I think that in all three cases, they realize that they're paying for something, and if they don't think the benefits are worth it, they won't be happy about it, and the body politic responds. But my claim only is that in the current situation, much of the deficit financing of the last 20 years, we've run deficit almost all but one or two of those 20 years. The deficit financing of those decades has not been through monetization of debt, and has been through, as you say, the lending of money from foreign central banks and foreign individuals and domestic lenders who buy those government bonds, so that the cost of it is perhaps not as transparent, but I also suspect it's not as large. I'm not sure about that. I have to think about that. I might be wrong.
Well, I guess the only thing that I trust you and I can agree about is this, that you probably would prefer to live in a society in which when you and I vote for something, we feel the cost. I imagine you agree that we will feel the cost much more tangibly if we have to pay for it in taxes, or if we have to pay for it in debt that cannot get too high, because after all, that debt must always come out of taxes. But if there is that third way, that escape valve, which government really has been instituting, has enjoyed for hundreds of years, which is the printing of money, which is the reason, of course, in my view, why it's wanted to monopolize the money supply, then we have potential dangers. We don't feel it quite as directly if it's going to be inflation. Partly, by the way, because not everybody even understands, even to this day, as you have pointed out numerous times in your own podcast, that inflation comes from that the rise of prices comes from the increase in the money supply.
No,
so it's a much healthier society. I imagine you agree if we pay for it in taxes.
I agree with all of that. No,
okay.
the only question, and this is the issue I have with some parts of the advocacy of a gold standard. The only question is that we might disagree on is the empirical question of how costly it has been in recent decades to have a Federal Reserve as opposed to an alternative. So let's move let's move to that.
Yeah.
When I look at the Federal Reserve over the last 50 years, I see a surprisingly decent track record. And I know this is in contrast to your view and others. I see relatively stable output. I see a very dampened business cycle. I see unemployment being in relatively narrow bounds. And I don't want to attribute all of that economic performance to the Fed. It's not. But I don't, given that we have not had hyperinflation in the United States and very mild levels of inflation over the last 50 years, and more importantly, relatively stable levels, not just the level of inflation, but how widely it varies. We had some bad times in the late 70s. That was a disaster. Agreed. But overall, the 50-year period of, say, the post-war period, post-World War II period, it's pretty mild. I understand all those temptations of the government to print money as a way of financing government spending, but we have not been very prone to it, it seems to me. So I am not as upset about the status quo as you are, I think, or as others. So make the case for why I should be.
Sure. Well, first, let me partially agree with you. By the way, as an economics columnist, I'm often accused by Barron's readers, who tend to be rather dour about the economy, of being too upbeat. And so I don't completely disagree with you about the record of the last 50 years. I actually looked more recently at the record of the last 60 years, that is from 1947, the post-World War II period, through 2007. I want to just backtrack and say briefly that actually, if I had to summarize my main problem with the regime that we have, I would say it makes it much easier for the government to fund wars, and that when the central bank came in 1913, it financed World War I, which I think the U.S. should not have been involved in. It should have been neutral and tried to force both parties to settle. Wars, I think, are the main problem. But setting that aside, let's deal with your question. Over the last 60 years, if you'll follow me from 1947 through 2007, the NBER, which keeps the track record on business cycles, showed that nearly 9 of them were years of recession, years, that is, in which the economy either did not grow or contracted, and 51 of them were years of growth. My calculations show that those 51 years then did all the heavy lifting.
Sure.
They're the reason why we're more than 7 times richer than we were in 1947. And had those other 9 years also participated in the same way, we would be about 40% richer. That is, we'd have about 4.6 trillion extra GDP, but for those 9 lost years. Now, that's not a tragedy. On the other hand, we should also add that we've also gone through periods of double-digit unemployment, as we did in the early 80s. We also have rather upsetting times right now, although I will heartily agree with you. We do have a 5% unemployment rate, and that's relatively low, but we do have bankruptcies, foreclosures. There's a lot of human anguish that goes into those, that has gone into those years. And the other thing that we are looking at over the last couple of cycles are extended periods of what economists call growth recessions. That is, a growth recession, as I'm sure you know, has been defined as a period in which the economy grows, but not fast enough to prevent the unemployment rate from rising. And we had an extended growth recession after the 91 downturn, and an extended growth recession after the downturn of 2001. And those are bad also.
So I agree with all that,
yeah.
Naturally.
Sure.
The question is, what does that have to do with a change from a central bank determined money supply and a gold standard? Sure. Tell me how a gold standard, and one of the problems with this issue, by the way, in my limited reading on it, is that the details of how this would work are sometimes left kind of vague, and it's a cheap shot to say, well, how would it work exactly? But give us a rough overview of what you have in mind when you say a return to a gold standard or a gold standard that would not have a prominent role or no role for the Fed.
Well, that's a very key question. I should want to emphasize something rather ironic right now, which is that we're talking about what is essentially the Austrian theory of the business cycle, and we always like to get the Austrians and get this kind of view. We always want to lend it whatever respectability we can, because it was, again, drummed out of the temple in the 1930s by John Maynard Keynes. As you know, Friedrich Hayek, who was one of the main theorists of the Austrian business cycle, won a Nobel Prize in economics in 1974 for that work, and so it has some respectability. And then on top of that, if you actually read what some of the mainstream economists have been writing lately, it's almost like we are all Austrians. We all tend to understand that the bubbles of the last two recessions, that is the housing bubble. Well, excuse me, we are necessarily in a recession right now, but probably we are. The housing bubble, which has precipitated the recession that we probably are in now, the internet bubble that precipitated the 2001 downturn, were essentially due to the expansion of credit. You can even read that in Charles Kindleberger's classic work on manias and crashes. He has written, and I'm reading the first sentence of one of his chapters, "Speculative manias gather speed through expansion of money and credit, or perhaps in some cases get started because of an initial expansion of money and credit." And Kindleberger was by no means an Austrian, but he sounds like one. So I think it's fairly intuitive that the expansion of money and credit is what precipitates these things. And then the next question is, and certainly Friedman thought about it, and others thought about it, although Friedman had mixed feelings about the Austrian business cycle theory as well. But the next question is, what do we do in order to prevent the feckless expansion of credit? Well, what we can do, and now let's imagine a very different world in which let's take a leap of faith and just imagine that all the governments of the world decide to go back to gold. And back to gold does not mean going back to the sort of gold standard we used to have, because it was honored in the breach for centuries. Honored in the breach in the sense that banks were allowed to expand money and credit, and when they did so, they were protected by government, because usually they were in cahoots with government. A brief story that should stand for many is that the War of 1812 was essentially financed through the expansion of money and credit by certain banks, which used that money to buy government bonds to finance the war. That money was then spent in New England to purchase armaments, the money went into the hands of the New England banks, who then were sitting on that that paper and asked for redemption. They wanted that paper to be redeemed in gold. The government and state and federal government then protected the banks that had issued the specie. It issued the money. I shouldn't say specie, forgive me. They issued the specie as gold. They issued the money, and they couldn't redeem because they expended money and credit beyond their ability to do so, and they were protected by government. Now, what we then should have is a very simple rule, which says that we're on a gold standard and that banks have got to keep 100% reserves. Now, 100% reserves simply means...
And when you say banks, do you mean private banks or central banks?
Private banks.
So you're going to have privately issued money.
That's right. Privately issued money with gold as backing. They're essentially warehouses for gold. Think of a warehouse in which you and I have money. We have, say, let's say you and I have I have $100,000 in gold. I park it in a bank. Now, the bank issues me redemption certificates that are essentially money that say this bank will redeem gold for a certain amount. You know, that each of these dollars, as I imagine you know, dollars and sterling and so on were originally, pound sterling, were originally specified. Pound sterling originally meant a pound of silver. The dollar originally came from the thaler, which was weighted in silver. I say gold just to simplify it. Silver was also used as money, but let's just stick with gold just to make it simple. The rule would simply say this, that just as when you and I are storing number 2 red winter wheat in a warehouse, we don't allow, we're given certificates for it, and we don't allow the warehouse to lend part of the wheat out to somebody else. Since the wheat is fungible, we don't insist on exactly the same red winter wheat that we stored, but we don't allow the warehouse to give it away to somebody else on loan, because it is, after all, our wheat, just as this is, after all, our gold. However, if we have $100,000, do we really want it all to be ready cash balances? Probably not. The bank could probably sell us on the idea of saving some of it. That the bank would then say, we're going to give you a certificate of deposit that has a 5-year term, which means you can't redeem immediately, and that would allow us to look for people to lend this money to. Similarly, of course, if you and I have gold, we can participate in initial public offerings of stock, or we could buy bonds from a corporation with that money, or we could invest in a venture capital firm. All the usual ways in which saving goes on would, of course, go on in this new world. On the other hand, it would become impossible for anyone to lend out money based upon demand balances, which is what banks do. It would be impossible for the money supply, money and credit, to expand anywhere beyond the actual saving decisions that people make. Now, would that mean it would be impossible to have speculative bubbles? No, never say never. It would be possible. However, there would be a much greater chance that the fast buck artists who sell people homes they can't afford because the prices are going up, because the money supply is expanding, and it's okay to lend to somebody who cannot afford to pay his mortgage, because after all, the value of his house is going up. Or it's okay for people to buy internet stocks that aren't going to earn anything because the money supply is expanding, and after all, these prices are going up. All of those speculative bubbles that essentially are built on the expansion of money and credit beyond savings decisions would not happen. And therefore, it would be far less likely, almost unlikely, that you'd have anything like the speculative bubbles of the last 15 to 20 years that have brought about downturns.
But we had many speculative bubbles, although there's interesting differences of opinion on how, quote, irrational or speculative various run-ups in asset prices have been in history. But let's take that as given, that that
Oh,
there
well,
are
let's take that
bubbles.
as given. Indeed, as I say, let's read Charles Kinderberger's Manias, Panics, and Crashes, and he was by no means an Austrian. As I just read, he said it essentially rises on a sea of expanding money and credit.
Right, but
and
here's
indeed,
the problem.
that's why I gave the story of 1812. The Federal Reserve did invent the idea of expanding money and credit beyond savings decisions. The Federal Reserve merely made it more formalized and codified it and lent it respectability, and not incidentally gave the economists as a class a role in all this. And I think that the trajectory of Alan Greenspan's career pretty much parallels that it's very exciting to be chairman of the Federal Reserve. Suddenly the economists became powerful people in the 20th century. Not just professors who taught things, who did what you and I do.
Yeah, no, I understand that, and I agree with you. And it just, for those out there who don't know the history, Federal Reserve was created in 1913. There was no Federal Reserve before that. We had a gold standard in the United States, not quite like the one you're making the case for. Actually, very little like it, but we had a gold standard in the past. But my question was, there were speculative bubbles many times. Part of the reason there were speculative bubbles in the past wasn't simply because the federal government, say, was in cahoots with private banks in the case of the War of 1812, but also because of flows of gold in and out of economies for all kinds of reasons, some of which are probably less likely now. Just to take one, the discovery of a new source of gold has a expansionary impact on the money supply and therefore can lead to hyperinflation. The discovery of silver in the New World was very destructive to the price level in Europe. The discovery of gold in California in 1849, the gold rush had an inflationary impact on the world because of the gold standard. So the gold standard doesn't totally insulate us from that.
Quite right.
But what I'm more concerned about is two issues, one of which is institutional and the other is political. The institutional issue is, in the past, under a gold standard, where the nations, as you point out in your ideal policy world, the nations of the world would agree to move to a gold standard rather than just one nation. And in the past, when there was an international gold standard, which I think the so-called classical period was the late 19th century up to the First World War, so roughly 1880 to 1913. In that period, there was not prices were more stable, but we did have speculative problems. We did have a business cycle. So I assume you're arguing that was because in those times, the institutional gold standard arrangements are not the ones you're advocating, correct?
That's right. Yeah, and I think we can. I strongly believe especially when it comes to this issue, in Occam's razor, that is trying to that simple arguments are best. There is, I think, a very intriguing and I think essentially plausible argument that if you keep the government out of the printing of money, out of the business of money, which the government dearly likes to be in because it loves to print money and rather than tax and borrow. Yeah. But if you keep the government out, then other banks, just as in the story I told about 1812, other banks will force a bank that expands too much or that does not practice essentially 100% backing into doing so, or it's going to cause a run on that bank. Now, that's important, but it's also possible. We can't rule out the possibility that the banks could all form this enormous cartel, worldwide cartel, and support each other. And so let's just simplify it and say a simple rule: just as the government has only one rule, which is it enforces the contract. The contract simply says that just as you have the wheat in the warehouse and they can't lend out the wheat, you got the gold in the warehouse, and that's banking it, like a Long River Bank, which we get a little confused about what banks really do. Banks lend, but they also just allow you to deposit money. Yeah. They hold it for you. It's a warehouse. The warehouse has got to keep your gold there, and that would be a matter of law. It would harm you. You could sue them if they don't abide by that. So now that's almost never been the case in the history of the gold standard. And so if we simply understand that,
which part is? I'm sorry.
Forgive me. The part about the 100% backing.
Correct.
Yeah. And that part has never been the case. So if we understand that the 100% backing is the case, then, as a matter of fact, you create other questions, but you don't create the question about the expansion of the money supply. Now, but getting back to your... I'm sorry?
I'm not sure that's true.
Well, okay.
Isn't part of the issue historically, again, maybe you have something else in mind, but historically with the gold standard, balance of payments, deficits and surpluses were settled with gold flows.
That's right.
Is that part of your...
Well, sure, because the point, you see that's the other part of it, which is that that gold flows. It's a famous point. I think it was Hume who made that point about the ways in which countries call each other to account. That you cannot expand too much because one country will ask for your gold. There'll be gold outflows. And that's very similar to essentially the same as the point I made about banks B, C, and D calling Bank A to account if Bank A expands too much. Because what will happen if Bank A starts lending out your money and mine that we've put in as a demand deposit, then that money is going to be spent more than likely by businesses that will purchase supplies or purchase labor with it, and that those laborers and those suppliers will then deposit the certificates in other banks. And those other banks, B, C, D, and E, will hold those certificates and then force Bank A to deliver the gold. Bank A is going to go under. Bank A is going to suffer a run from banks B, C, and D. Now, that's the reason why, if the government actually just leaves hands off and simply allows contracts to be enforced, then 100% backing will almost be the rule rather than the exception. However, I want to simplify it and that's similar to the point you're making about the ways in which on the international scene, in which one country called another country to account. There were gold outflows if another country was expanding too much, expanding its money supply and weakening its currency and so on. That's also the case. However, let's just simplify it and say, let's treat banks like warehouses. Let's just have 100% backing and prevent the expansion of money and credit for that reason. That was never done. So that's the simple rule. And when you talk about the politics of it, of course, we have it's a can of worms. It's of course potentially a non-starter.
That's okay. And that's not what I was going to say. I mean, I think the fact that it's a non-starter is irrelevant here at EconTalk because we're not running for office. Neither of us. Our goal is to make the world a better place.
But I wanted to get back to your point about the expansion of gold. I had a letter from a reader who said, well, gee, with modern technology and alchemy, they can probably find a way, some smart person probably find a way to double the money supply, the gold supply rather, through some kind of electrochemical process, and wouldn't that be very destabilizing? And I wrote back, yeah, well, you're absolutely right. You can't rule anything out. That could be the case, but I'm sorry?
That's not my worry.
Not my worry, but my point is that, that'll be one moment of disruption, but he can't keep doubling the gold supply endlessly, right?
No, correct. There might be a short run spike.
Yeah, and then of course we can, let's revive Goldfinger. He had some plots also about the gold supply. Clearly, by the way, that's the reason why I emphasize that. No, you can't rule out the potential for the world on a gold and silver standard. Probably it would be silver as well, but let's not bring that in too much. You can't rule out the possibility that on a gold standard there would be some disruption. But nothing like the sort of thing, obviously, that plagues other countries, or even the sort that plagues this one. If in this country we have, just as you say, and just as I agree, we have not had disaster. We have not had the Great Depression. We've had, let's say, worst case,
in the last
wrenching
60
unemployment.
Years.
I'm sorry?
In the last 60 years. We have had the Great Depression.
Sure, I'm sorry?
We have had the Great Depression just in the last 60 years.
Thank you. Exactly. Over the last 60 years, we have not had the Great Depression. We have had, $4.6 trillion in lost GDP. We've had wrenching unemployment. We've had wrenching foreclosures and bankruptcies, and lives destroyed to some extent by jobs disappearing. On the other hand, we have not had 25% unemployment.
No.
But if that's the case, then the U.S. can do even better if it were on the sort of gold standard that I speak of. In addition, as I say, with respect to output, I also believe that the government would be sopping up less in the way of our hard-earned money if we force them to tax us and then only to borrow to the extent that municipalities and states can borrow when they need to borrow. We'd have much more of our own resources for our own use. Which is the additional advantage.
I'm all for that. Let me make the mainstream economist argument, and then I want to challenge one of your components of the idea that you're putting forward.
Sure.
Most economists, which I'm not one, but most economists would say that we don't. Excuse me. This part I would agree with. We don't have a very good understanding of what causes the business cycle. While I am sympathetic to the Austrian theory of the business cycle, which I don't know very much about, I confess, despite my Austrian passions in other parts of economics. But in the area of macroeconomics, I don't know much about the Austrian theory. But I'm certainly open and sympathetic to the possibility that credit expansion distorts price signals, which is my understanding of particularly interest rates, which is what I think is the key to the Austrian business cycle theory, and that's a real problem with the Fed, that the Fed, by its constant attempts to fine-tune the economy for both political and perhaps well-intentioned reasons, that can be very destructive. I agree with all that. But what most mainstream economists would say, and this part I also agree with, is that we don't have a very good understanding of the business cycle. That part may be true. It may be true that distortions of interest rates and the overexpansion of credit through artificial means used by the Fed can lead to business cycles. But I would argue that there are probably other causes of business cycles. And I would just say agnostically, I don't think we have a very good understanding of it as a profession. It's an embarrassment, but a fact. I'm also very sympathetic to your view that the empowering of macroeconomists through the existence of the Fed is a very destructive force for scholarship and research. So this is one area where I think one has to be very skeptical of received wisdom from the mainstream, certainly about what a gold standard would actually be like, or et cetera. So let me now go to one institutional component that I'm concerned about, which is the 100% reserve requirement. Mm-hmm. So just to summarize the argument so far, the way I understand it, we could improve macroeconomic performance relative to past practice by moving away from a discretionarily controlled money supply through a central bank to to give government a more hands-off role. And that particular hands-off role would be to maintain contracts between banks and citizens, enforce them, and to require perhaps, or maybe this would emerge, the 100% reserve requirement. I think what some people have criticized that idea with is the resource costs of providing the gold to back up that money.
Mm-hmm.
I think Friedman has argued it would be in the hundreds of billions of dollars, which maybe is a very small number, but it seems like a largish number. Is that a relevant concern?
The resource costs?
Well, you've got to hold
the resource costs. You have to accumulate gold.
You have to accumulate a lot of gold, and have it, and
Well, accumulate a lot of gold. Yeah. Are we talking about a one-time cost or a continuous cost?
I don't know. You tell me, because I know there's a transition. There's a transition issue.
Yeah, I mean, of course, happily, as you know, I think. By the way, it's rather interesting, isn't it, that the federal government made it illegal for citizens to hold gold in the 1930s, only finally making it legal to do so by 1975. So we're not going to prevent people from buying and selling gold, and we already have, I guess, a lot of costs in that regard. It was, by the way, predicted by the mainstream economists that once you legalize gold, it would be traded as for its ornamental and limited industrial uses, and they turned out to be quite wrong. There is obviously an interest in it. It wouldn't be priced at, it wouldn't make $1,000. It wouldn't be worth $1,000 an ounce if it were an industrial and ornamental metal. It clearly traded as a precious metal, and so probably we already have all those costs right now because we do happily allow citizens to own gold and speculate in it if they want to. So there's a massive market for gold in the world, and it's not bankrupting us. And so now, but even accepting your $2 trillion, $200 billion, if you at least go part of the way toward allowing for the possibility that some business cycles would be obliterated, would not happen, then perhaps the 4.6 trillion in extra income that I spoke of will whittle down to just a mere trillion. That's worth something. That probably will come out ahead.
It's worth a lot. I just haven't thought enough about it to know whether the statement when banks would back up currency with 100% gold. I'm not quite sure how we get there from here or what that would involve.
Well, how we get there? No, that's of course how we get there from here is a question that I've been ducking. Absolutely, I'm glad you haven't asked me that yet. But
we're almost out of time.
That would be
Gene.
very difficult. How we get back, by the way, to essentially a world in which, I think, by the way, an important Austrian insight is that it's not just that historically money came from gold, it came from a commodity. It's, as Ludwig von Mises, the premier Austrian, pointed out, it's impossible for money to come from anything other than a commodity. It cannot be created overnight. It's got to originate from a commodity. Because just as, there's an interesting story, you probably are aware of the famous story about the British POW camp that used cigarettes as money.
Sure.
Why did they use cigarettes as money? Isn't that a waste of cigarettes? Because the fact is that money can only come from a commodity that everybody tends to want. Because on day one, it's not worth anything. It only would be worth what its intrinsic commodity, what it's worth as an intrinsic commodity. So how do we get back to that world? That's an important question. But I believe that the costs of maintaining that world, in terms of gold simply being stored in warehouses or gold coins being minted, it would not be too expensive because by and large people would use paper certificates and store their gold. I thought you were going to say that to speak of the fact that we would no longer have investment that would originate from the printing of money. But I imagine you don't mind, and neither do I, mind a situation in which all investment decisions actually come from saving decisions. The other part, of course, a key way in which we all save is through reinvested earnings. As shareholders, we allow corporations to reinvest earnings. And by the way, I happen to think that our actual level of savings is higher than officially quoted. Personal savings is even higher than officially quoted.
Certainly
but
is.
Plenty of savings going on, and plenty of savings would go on in that world, but it would all be done prudently. I had another reader wrote in and asked me, well, gee, wouldn't that mean that nobody would take any risk? There wouldn't be any innovation. But of course there would be innovation. There would be, the high risk would require the potential for high gain.
No, it's a horrifying thought to think that innovation has relied on the printing of money. It seems not
sure. But maybe I wanted to get back to one a point you made about business cycles. When we look at, it's commonly thought that the housing bubble can be blamed on the expansion of money and credit. That in fact, Paul Krugman has been saying that. Jeffrey Sachs has been saying that, and it's rather a scandal that they say that. They condemn the Federal Reserve, but they never teach this theory in their classrooms. And I also think that when we look at the Internet bubble, It's very clear that would have been impossible, but for the expansion of money and credit. A situation in which people are buying stocks just simply based on momentum, not because the dot-com can ever make any money, but because you can sell the dot-com to some greater fool than you who'll buy it for more than you paid for it.
Yeah, but I don't think that has. Again, although I'm sympathetic to much of what you're saying, I don't think you can claim that the dot-com bubble or other speculative bubbles in the past are simply the result that they couldn't have existed without an expansionary credit. Certainly people can think that assets are going to be worth more in the future than they're worth today without inflation.
Oh, yes. No. Again, right? That's the reason why I try to emphasize I don't. It is a danger that these arguments can be caricatured. And by the way, most of the gold advocates I am acquainted with are a little bit nuts, I have to say. But of course, it's conceivable that in the world in which the world I'm describing of 100% gold backing, that irrationally exuberant folks can start bidding something up. It's just that it's unlikely that they can do it on such a broad scale as in the housing market or as in the stock market, where so much money can be poured in. There just would not be enough money and credit to create such massive bubbles. That's why it's just very unlikely that it could become a major problem. But I'm not indicating that in fact was Greenspan's, I think, personal bankruptcy, intellectual bankruptcy, was when he said that it all gets back to the imperfections of humankind. Of course, human beings, there are plenty of irrationally exuberant people among human beings, but it takes the Federal Reserve to give them the drug so that they can do a lot of harm. They can do some harm, even in the world in which I'm describing, but not the sort of harm that could lead to downturns. That's far less likely, is what I'm arguing.
Okay, well, we're almost out of time. Let me close with a confession and then give you the last word.
Sure.
My confession is that, and any listener to EconTalk knows this is true, that macroeconomics is quite complicated. I have a little understanding of it, but what makes it complicated, I wish I had more, which is why I interview people like you, Gene, because I'm interested in trying to understand it. And many of these macro money Fed conversations are me asking sometimes naive questions, trying to re-educate myself from my training in my youth or change my education. So my confession is this. I think these ideas are very interesting. I'm deeply sympathetic to the idea that government misuses the power it's given, and certainly the power to print money is easily abused, and prone to the incentives to abuse it are quite strong. I would argue that to the extent that government has kept its monetary activities constrained is due to the better understanding I think people have of how inflation is caused by increases in money supply. And that has constrained the Fed somewhat in our times. What you're arguing may perhaps, and I'm interested in reading and learning and thinking about it some more, as I'm sure our listeners are, may perhaps lead to a better world. It's politically unlikely, as we started to talk about, this is what I want to close with. It's politically unlikely, for obvious reasons, that politicians like power and economists like power, and as you say, that they both benefit from the current system. But can you imagine a world where, through education or a change of cultural understanding, more people would advocate a gold standard? Is that a possibility? And what would it take?
Well,
to get government to give up that power.
Yeah. Well, first, you have spoken eloquently about the purpose of EconTalk and the purpose you try to serve in the classroom and in other ways to get people more aware of the power of markets. We'd like the government. Happily, the government is involved in agriculture in the same way that the Soviet Union was. That's why we eat. That's why we don't starve the way they did in the Soviet Union, but for the fact that the U.S. gave them food aid, or the way they did in China before they allowed more capitalism. And similarly, greater awareness can lead to change. And that's the purpose that EconTalk serves, and I am honestly deeply impressed by your openness here you are, a tenured professor, and you're willing to ask naive questions about what goes on in the economy. And that's, by the way, the only way to be a journalist. I keep telling young journalists the key rule about being an economic journalist is always ask. And in fact, I don't use the word naive; I use dumb.
Yeah, I'm just
you ask
covering.
your dumbest questions, because sometimes your dumbest questions can be your smartest.
Yeah.
Because if you don't understand it, maybe it's not. Maybe your skepticism is justified. And so I think that skepticism about the monetary regime we have is justified, and greater awareness of the harm it does. And I emphasize that a good part of the Iraqi war was brought to us by the power of our government, not just to sell its bonds to its own Federal Reserve, but to sell its bonds to the central banks around the world. And if you object to the Iraqi war, then maybe you'll object to the monetary regime we have. I say that especially to the fans of Noam Chomsky and others. By the way, I'm also a fan of Noam Chomsky. Second, if you recognize that while our business cycles aren't as bad as they used to be, they still cause a lot of harm, then you'll begin to wonder, why is it that the Krugmans and some of the other mainstream economists are talking about how the Federal Reserve has helped to cause these things, and then wonder what can be done to change it, to make for a more stable monetary regime. And thirdly, this has been an issue we haven't explored. We somewhat differ over what's happened over the last 20 years. I absolutely agree with you, by the way, that Paul Volcker started the high priesthood of Federal Reserve chairmen who care about making sure that galloping inflation doesn't return. But Greenspan and now Bernanke have greatly been helped by the end of the Cold War, which caused a massive disinflation around the world, by the increase in productivity, which also helped cause disinflation. And Greenspan, I think in the only really valuable part of his recent book, points out that by 2030, the future Federal Reserve chairman is going to feel a lot of pressure to expand the money supply, and he himself fears that galloping inflation will return. And so that's a third reason to be concerned, and to think that maybe we can head it off by thinking clearly about the potential to replace this monetary regime with a 100% gold standard.
My guest today has been Gene Epstein, economics editor at Barron's. Gene, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
A pleasure. Thanks very much.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.